Hi, and welcome back to the first lecture of Period 5. Period 5 is going to cover all of the years that include the Civil War and the Reconstruction after the Civil War. And we're going to get started with the learning objective. It is explain the context in which the sectional conflict emerged from 1844 to 1877. The first key concept is that the United States became more connected with the world, pursued an expansionist foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, and emerged as a destination for many migrants from other countries. So the United States engaged in war with Mexico in 1845, and it gained the Mexican cession, all of the Western Territory west of Texas. It competed with Great Britain for claims over the Oregon Territory, and it filled in that part of the territory with the 49th parallel being the border between British Canada and the United States. So this is how the United States is engaging in foreign policy and being more connected with the world. At the same time, we have immigrants coming from Ireland or Germany, the first large wave of immigration. That happens because of the Irish potato famine and some political instability in the area that is now Germany. Now, this expansion is what's going to lead to an increase in the debate over the issue of slavery, which will eventually get us to the Civil War. So here's Manifest Destiny. Popular enthusiasm for U.S. expansion, bolstered by economic and security interests, resulted in the acquisition of new territories, substantial migration westward, and new overseas initiatives. So Manifest Destiny was this idea that the country was going to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And this was a notion that really began after the purchase of the Louisiana Territory and the Lewis and Clark expedition. They actually went further than the boundary of the Louisiana Territory and went all the way to the coast in Oregon. This was achieved in phases. We had the Louisiana Purchase in the previous historical period, the annexation of Texas, and then in this historical period, we have the Mexican-American War that ends with the secession of all the Western territory that Mexico used to have, and then the addition of Oregon. Mining and railroad opportunities in the West begin to draw settlers. So there's a transcontinental railroad that's being built connecting both parts of the country. And at the same time, we find gold and silver in the Western states, especially in California in 1848 and 1849 with the California Gold Rush. Once we get to the West Coast, we are now able to more readily trade with Asian powers, so Japan and China. The United States attempts to open up Japan in 1853 to 1854, a country that had previously shut itself off from international trade by choice. And then at the end of the Civil War in 1866, the Secretary of State is going to purchase Alaska. And at the time, the value for Alaska was not really clear to everyone. It used to be called Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox because people at the time didn't realize that there were as many natural resources as we now know that there are in Alaska. So in the 1840s and 1850s, Americans continued to debate questions about rights and citizenship for various groups of U.S. inhabitants. When it comes to immigrants, we see a rise of nativism. Nativism is an anti-immigrant sentiment that's trying to limit the rights of newcomers. It's trying to keep them from voting, and it's trying to limit their immigration into the United States as a whole. This begins with some anti-Irish and anti-German sentiments. Some anti-Catholicism sentiments are also in there, and it's going to continue through the rest of the 19th century with different immigrant groups. So the Chinese are going to be another immigrant group that nativists are not going to like. Chinese are coming into the United States through the West Coast as guest workers, working on railroads, making a wage, and then making their way back to China. Later on in the next historical period, we'll see that the United States actually shuts off all immigration coming in from China with the Chinese Exclusion Act. In terms of rights for African Americans, in 1857, the Supreme Court case Dred Scott v. Sanford, decided by Roger Taney, decides that African Americans are not considered citizens by the U.S. Constitution. And not only are they not considered citizens by the U.S. Constitution, any enslaved person, any African American that is enslaved is considered property. And based on the U.S. Constitution, property cannot be taken away from U.S. citizens without due process. So this meant that slavery was technically legal everywhere in the United States, regardless if a state had outlawed slavery before in the early 19th or late 18th century. And so it really blew up the slavery question because Southern states that practiced slavery thought that they had really won, that they could practice slavery wherever they wanted. Native Americans won't have citizenship until 1924 with a special act of Congress. And because of that, they're going to be prone to having land taken without due process as the United States continues to expand westward. All right, and so now we're going to move on to the major event in period five, and that is the Civil War. Intensified by expansion and deepening regional divisions, debates over slavery and other economic, cultural, and political issues led to the nation into civil war. So, as the debate over slavery was continuing to grow because the country was also continuing to expand, the Compromise of 1850 was meant to try and keep everyone happy on both sides on the expansion of slavery, trying to limit it to certain places, which is what the North wanted, and for the South to try and expand it as much as it could. So this throws out the old 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise and starts allowing popular sovereignty. So each territory was able to begin choosing whether or not they would practice slavery in that territory, in any federally organized territory. The South continues to rely on cotton as their main export and slavery as its main labor. Lincoln's election, which was perceived as a precursor for the federal government ending slavery, is going to cause South Carolina to secede in December of 1860. As it tries to declare its own independence from the United States, it's also trying to take over all of the federal forts within the territory. So Fort Sumter was a federal fort inside of South Carolina, and the federal troops inside of the fort did not want to just give up and give the forts to the South Carolina government. And so they hold out as the South Carolina troops start to bombard it. And eventually, the people inside of the fort run out of supplies and have to give up. South Carolina's secession was based on compact theory. This is something that we talked about early in period three. And it was developed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. It stated that states had come into a pact in the form of the US Constitution, and any time that that pact did not suit them, they were allowed to either A, nullify or ignore federal law, call it unconstitutional, or B, leave that pact whenever they found that it did not suit them any longer. And as South Carolina secedes, others will follow, so that by the time that Abraham Lincoln takes office in 1861, there will be 11 states that have already seceded from the Union. So the ideological and economic differences over slavery produced an array of diverging responses from Americans in the North and the South. So in the South, slavery was seen as central to the Southern society. We talked about this at the end of period four. And this continues into period five. In the Confederacy, the Vice President, Alexander Stephens, seen in the top right, makes a speech that's often referred to as the cornerstone speech, in which he says that slavery is the cornerstone to this new Confederacy. The idea that the two different races are unequal, that the white race is better than the black race, and so therefore the black race should be in servitude, is central to the Confederacy. The economic importance of cotton to the South is the main reason why the South was so invested in the institution of slavery. In the North, there is a growing abolitionist feeling. So the fugitive slave law that passed as a result of the Compromise of 1850 also could criminalize Northerners who were helping fugitive slaves run away. This made the Northerners much more antagonistic towards slavery. In the 1850s, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a long novel that details all of the negative aspects of slavery in a fictionalized account. And it becomes wildly popular, not just in the United States, but also across the world. In Great Britain, it's read amongst abolitionist circles. and it begins to create a moral sympathy for those who are enslaved. And the North begins to have more abolitionist feeling. Also, the diverse economy in the North led to a greater tendency to oppose slavery because enslaved labor was a direct competition against free labor, and it depressed the wages of those that were working in free labor. We do have some political party turmoil, so debates over slavery came to dominate political discussions in the 1850s, culminating in the bitter election of 1860 and the secession of Southern states. So there is a lot of jumbling in political parties in the 1860s. The anti-slavery parties of the 1850s, the Free Soil and the Liberty Party, they consolidate their support behind the Republican Party, which had just formed in 1856. And in 1860, they run for the second time a presidential election with Abraham Lincoln, and they win. They are perceived to be the anti-slavery party in the South. Meanwhile, the main competitor to the Republican Party was the Democratic Party. They had been created by Andrew Jackson back in the 1820s. And it split into a northern and southern faction. So for the first time, this unifying political party between the North and the South also is split just like everything else due to sectionalism. And the divide between the votes of the Northern Democratic Party and the Southern Democratic Party allow Lincoln to win despite not being even on the ballot in Southern states. So he is a minority president. He does not receive a majority of the popular vote, but he does win a majority of the electoral votes because the Northern states had large population centers that gave them more electoral votes. All right, so the Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issues of slavery and secession, but left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship rights. So the main accomplishments of Reconstruction were the Reconstruction Amendments. That's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment deals with citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment is speaking about voting specifically. So now anyone who is born in the United States is automatically a citizen, and as long as they are male, they have the rights to vote guaranteed to them. Now, during the entire Reconstruction period, emancipated people had been offered help and assistance to try and re-enter civil society in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau. So they offered education opportunities, information on how to vote, access to land in some cases. But in 1877, Reconstruction ends after the contested presidential election. There is a deal that is made between the Republicans and the Democrats that the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, is going to be given the presidency as long as he ends this radical Reconstruction that had been enforced by the military in the South. Because the support for Reconstruction as a whole had waned due to economic depressions or economic panic in the 1870s. So support for African Americans dwindle during this time period after Reconstruction, and they are about to enter what is called the nadir of African American history. This is going to be the lowest point. That's what nadir actually means. We're going to see Jim Crow laws and other discriminatory measures, violence and intimidation that is going to be exerted over them. Now, during the Civil War, the North's greater manpower and industrial resources, the leadership of Abraham Lincoln and others, and the decision to emancipate slaves eventually led to the Union military victory over the Confederacy in the devastating Civil War. These are all of the causes for victory that the College Board wants you to know. And so we're going to go one by one. In terms of manpower, the North, the Union, had larger urban centers, and they had a much larger free population. There were about 23 million people in the North, whereas there were only 5.5 million free people in the South. Now, they had an enslaved population of about 3.5 million for a total population of 9 million. Towards the end of the Civil War, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, is going to be so strapped for soldiers that he's actually going to offer African Americans the opportunity to fight for the Confederacy in exchange for their freedom. Now, for industrial resources, railroads are the most important because they allow the armies to be resupplied and to be moved into the battlefield quickly. And the Navy of the Union is also going to be very instrumental because it allows for the Navy to blockade the southern coasts, and that's going to limit the export of cotton from the South, which would be the only way in which the Confederacy would be able to get any sort of cash or any sort of traded goods. Now, Lincoln's leadership is really important. He comes into office in March of 1861 when the Confederacy had already formed and attacks on the Union or on Union forts had already happened. And so he's able to mobilize troops quickly, even though Congress is in recess. So he relies on the northern states to come up with volunteer armies, and they begin to mobilize and be moved into the battlefield. He is able to recognize when generals are ineffective, like McClellan, and he replaces them with effective ones like Ulysses Grant, seen in the bottom left and top right. His decision to emancipate the enslaved is also important because it changes the tone of the war and one of the main motives. And because now you have a moral motive for the war, it's going to limit the British help for the Confederacy. The British were still very much reliant on Southern cotton, and they were in the process of finding substitutes for that Southern cotton. They had flirted with the idea of helping the Confederacy. In fact, there are several instances in which they did try to help the Confederacy, but they also had a large abolitionist sentiment in Great Britain. And so as soon as this became a war about freedom, the British really stopped any type of help for the Confederacy. And it's also going to encourage black soldiers in the North to enlist, because if they see an opportunity for them to fight for others to gain their freedom, then it motivates them to fight. And we'll see this with Frederick Douglass becoming a recruiter for black regiments in the Civil War. Now, the devastation of war was widespread. Most of the battlefields were in the South, and this was a war of attrition. That means that there were high numbers of casualties on both sides. The military tactics that were still being used in the middle of the 19th century, when used with large amounts of soldiers, were going to yield high amount of casualties. As you can see in the picture, it's really just frontal combat with rifles, and as the armies get closer and closer together, they put the bayonets on their muskets and they have hand-to-hand combat. After the war, Southern infrastructure and its economy had been destroyed. On the top right, you see a picture of the Confederate capital of Richmond, and on the bottom left, you see some Union soldiers tearing up railroads in General Sherman's march to the sea through the state of Georgia. So in order to try and weaken the Confederacy further, they were trying to destroy all of the infrastructure that would allow them to continue to keep fighting. And so by the end of the war, all of this needed to be rebuilt. The Civil War had the highest casualties in proportion to population than any other American war, and that is still true to this day. All right, so for the impact of Reconstruction, Reconstruction and the Civil War ended slavery, altered relationships between the states and the federal government, and led to debates over new definitions of citizenship, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. So for the first part, ended slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation that was issued by Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War actually only freed those who were enslaved in the territories that were in rebellion. Those that were enslaved in the border states like Kentucky, Missouri, and had been loyal to the Union were not freed until the 13th Amendment. Once that is adopted, all slavery in the United States is going to be abolished. Now, the relationship between the states and the federal government is going to change to one that is more in favor of the federal government. This is a war in which the federal government proves its supremacy over the states. It forces the states to adopt the Reconstruction Amendments as a precondition for readmission. And the definition of citizenship is going to be redefined, or it's going to have a new definition. The 14th Amendment awards citizenship to all born in the United States. So regardless of skin color, national origin, ethnicity, or religion, if one is born in the United States, then they are awarded citizenship rights. And the 15th Amendment is going to guarantee voting rights for those citizens who are men. Women and American Indians, they're not mentioned in the 14th or 15th Amendment. Women's suffrage is not going to come until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. And Native American citizenship, as mentioned earlier in this lecture, is not going to happen until 1924. And when it does happen, they are going to be able to vote as well. All right, and so finally for the recap, I know that was a lot, so let's get through the summary here. The United States continued to expand as a result of manifest destiny. Full citizenship rights are limited to white adult males in the antebellum. We have territorial expansion that fuels the debates over slavery and it leads to the Civil War. The North and the South's views on slavery continue to diverge. Political compromises were not enough to keep the country together, speaking about the Compromise of 1850, and the election of a Republican president led to South Carolina's secession. The Union's victory included factors like Lincoln's leadership and its industrial strength, and then finally, Reconstruction brought an end to slavery. It guaranteed new rights, but its gains were ultimately temporary. All right, so I hope that gave you a really good overview of everything that we're going to talk about in more detail for each lecture that will follow this one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next lecture.